9:43 p.m., and my mother was telling someone how she tried to give me away. I was standing just outside her office, frozen, the soft hum of her voice slicing through the crack in the door like a scalpel. The house was dim, quiet, except for her. Calm, composed, and casually destroying everything I'd ever believed about myself. "I wanted to terminate," she said flatly. But by the time I knew, it was already too late. My parents were furious. He offered to marry me and, well, it was better than shame. That was how she came into the picture. She. Not Elena. Not my daughter. Just a complication. A problem she never solved. My hand shook as I reached for the doorframe. I could hear the ice clink in her glass. The way she sighed like she was just so tired of a mistake that kept walking around her house pretending to belong. "I tried to be kind," she went on, "but she was never easy, always asking questions, always needing more. Some children just don't bond." There was a pause, and then a small, awful laugh. "Maybe it was karma, but at least David turned out well." That was when something inside me cracked. Not a dramatic snap. Not yet. But the subtle fracture of something that had been holding together under pressure for far too long. I backed away before I could hear more. My body moved on instinct, down the hall, past the family portraits I now saw with new eyes. Her smile in those frames had always looked hollow. Now I knew why. She never loved me. Not once, not even for a second. Outside, the sky was thick with dark clouds. I stepped into the cold without my coat, the air biting at my skin, but nothing hurt worse than what I'd just heard. I didn't cry, not yet. Instead, I laughed, sharp and breathless, because what else do you do when you realize your entire life was built on someone else's lie? For years, I blamed myself, for her distance, her short fuse, her constant praise for David and the way she barely acknowledged me unless I disappointed her. I thought I wasn't good enough. I thought if I worked harder, smiled more, stayed quiet, maybe she'd look at me and see me. But now? Now I knew. I was never broken. She was. And if she thought her biggest regret was keeping me, I'd make sure that regret would grow teeth. There were no lullabies in our house, no soft goodnights, no arms around my shoulders when the world felt too heavy for small bones. Just silence, the kind that sat in corners and watched you cry without offering comfort. My room was at the end of the hall, just far enough from my mother's that I could hear her walking past and never pausing. Her footsteps always continued without hesitation, like I didn't exist, like I wasn't supposed to. When I was 7, I brought home a crayon drawing of her, smiling, holding my hand. I left it on the kitchen table with a note that said, "I love you, Mommy." She never mentioned it. Just threw it in the trash. I saw it that night, curled and torn beside an empty wine bottle. David brought home a C on his science test once, and she acted like he'd won a Nobel Prize. "He's gifted," she'd said, brushing his hair from his forehead. "He just doesn't like to show off." I brought home straight A's every time, and all she ever said was, "Keep it up." But even that was rare. Mostly, I got nothing. Not praise, not warmth, just a cold nod, a closed door. She never hit me. That would have at least made sense. Her weapon was absence. She could be in the same room and feel miles away. The only time her eyes really focused on me was when I embarrassed her, when I dared to speak too loudly in public or asked too many questions. Her silence then turned into sharp whispers. "Don't be difficult. Don't make a scene. Smile." I learned to fake it early. The smile, the laugh, the "I'm fine." Because what's the point of screaming when no one looks up? At night, I used to press my face into the pillow to muffle the sound, not crying, screaming, the kind of raw, silent sobbing that claws at your ribs and leaves your throat burning. But no one ever came. I could have disappeared, and I'm not sure she would have noticed until someone else pointed it out. There were moments, of course, when I thought maybe it was me, that something inside me was wrong, that maybe if I looked more like David, or laughed quieter, or didn't take up so much space, she'd love me. But I was a child, and children always assume it's their fault when love doesn't come. I stopped leaving drawings, stopped hoping, started building the walls myself. If she wasn't going to love me, I'd at least learn how to survive it. The rooms stayed cold, my tears stayed quiet, and the silence between us grew louder every year. I was 8 when I stopped trying to matter. It was the night of my birthday, a Tuesday, and I'd spent the whole week practicing how to smile in case anyone actually remembered. I wore the yellow dress Grandma once said brought out my eyes and sat perfectly still at the dinner table, waiting for something to happen. It didn't. Instead, my mother walked in carrying a sheet cake from the grocery store with "Congrats, David" scrawled across it in blue icing. My name wasn't anywhere. David had scored 2 touchdowns the weekend before. He was 11, fast, loud, and magnetic in a way I wasn't allowed to be. When he laughed, the room leaned toward him. When I spoke, my mother flinched like my voice was a mistake she'd forgotten to mute. She cut the cake, handed him the biggest piece, and said, "You're going places, sweetheart." He smirked at me over the frosting, and I smiled like it didn't hurt. No one noticed the balloons I'd taped to my door. No one asked why I wore a dress. I scraped the D from my slice and pretended it stood for deserve. That was always the rule in our house. David came first, not just in line, but in everything. He got the new clothes, the second helpings, the warmth. He was the son they wanted. I was the space in between. I remember once asking if I could try soccer, too. I was 10. My mother didn't even look up from her magazine when she said, "That's more David's thing. Let's not compete." Compete. As if I'd ever been allowed in the race. David didn't have to be good. He just had to show up. I could be perfect. I was perfect. And it still wasn't enough. Every piano recital? Ignored. Every art award? Shrugged off. One time I won first place in a statewide writing competition. My mother's response? David's coach thinks he might go varsity early. It wasn't spoken aloud. Not ever. But it didn't have to be. The way her eyes lit up for him. The way her shoulders tensed around me. The way every framed photo in the hallway featured his face twice for every one of mine. It was in the air, in the walls. You should have been him. If they could have swapped me out, reshaped me into someone louder, simpler, more digestible, they would have. But they didn't get the boy they wanted twice. They got me. The leftover, the afterthought. So I stopped asking. Stopped hoping. And somewhere deep in that silence, something darker started to grow. Not hate, not yet. Just awareness. One day, they'd wish they hadn't overlooked the quiet one. My cheeks always hurt after family photos. Not from smiling, from holding it too long. The kind of tight-lipped, frozen grin that doesn't reach your eyes, but looks polite enough to pass. That was the rule. Look happy, even when you weren't. Especially when you weren't. I learned it early. Stand beside David. Tilt your chin, hands folded neatly. Don't blink too much. Don't let your lips tremble. My mother's voice, sharp and low, would hiss from behind the camera. "Elena, fix your face." And I would. Because not fixing it meant consequences. The kind that didn't bruise but still left scars. There was a photo from Christmas when I was 11. I still remember the dress. Dark green velvet with a white lace collar. I hated the way it itched. David stood next to me, grinning wide with his new PlayStation in hand. I had a stack of books I didn't ask for. My mother said I liked quiet things. The photo made it to the mantel, but only after she cropped me out. "David looked better solo," she explained when I noticed. "Don't be so dramatic." So I learned to smile smaller, fade more gently. At school, teachers called me well-mannered. Friends' parents praised how respectful I was. What they didn't see was how I practiced my answers in the mirror, how I made sure my voice was soft enough not to irritate, how I swallowed down every instinct that made me real. Because being real never worked. Real was messy. Real got punished. So I became their version of acceptable, the quiet, obedient girl with clean fingernails and perfect posture. I handed out compliments like shields. I apologized before I was even blamed. I laughed at things that weren't funny, sat through dinners that felt like minefields, and kept my eyes dry until the door was shut. Smile, always smile. There was a time, maybe around 13, when I tried not smiling. Just once. It was for a family vacation photo. We were on a beach in Florida, the sun scorching and sand sticking to my skin. I didn't feel like pretending that day. I kept my face neutral. My mother noticed. Later that night, she poured herself a drink and said, "You looked sour, like you didn't belong with us." She took a long sip and added, "Try harder next time." I nodded and smiled. From then on, I wore the grin like armor. I polished it until it gleamed. I could flash it at strangers, relatives, even myself in the mirror. And almost believe it. Almost. Because smiling meant survival. And I was determined to survive. I was 12 the first time she called me too sensitive. It was after dinner. I had asked her gently if she could sit with me while I did my homework, just to be near her. I didn't even care if she helped. I just wanted her there. I don't know what I expected, but it wasn't her sigh. Wasn't the way she looked up from her wine glass like I'd just asked her to clean up a mess she didn't make. "God, Elena," she muttered, "you're so sensitive." That word clung to me like a label I hadn't asked for. Sensitive. Like it was a flaw. Like wanting something soft made me weak. After that, it became her answer to everything. Every time I asked why she never hugged me, "You're too sensitive." When I told her David scared me when he shouted, "You're too sensitive." The day I cried when she missed my recital, "Get a grip, Elena. You're just being dramatic." I stopped asking after a while, stopped crying in front of her, started swallowing it instead. But it didn't go away. The wanting, the ache. It just got quieter. There was one night I remember too clearly. I had tried to give her a letter I wrote, pouring out everything. How I felt invisible, how it hurt when she looked through me, how I just wanted to feel like her daughter. She read it silently, her face unreadable. Then she folded it, slid it back toward me, and said, "This is why I can't talk to you. You make everything into a tragedy." I didn't cry. I smiled, said, "Okay," took the letter back and burned it in the bathroom sink. After that, I turned it all inward. Every hurt, every dismissal. I told myself she was right, that it was me, that I was too much. I started apologizing for everything, for talking too long, for crying too easily, for needing too deeply. I practiced how to laugh at cruel jokes, how to nod when insulted, because that's what she did, rolled her eyes at emotion, laughed at vulnerability. David called me a baby once for tearing up during a sad movie. She didn't correct him. She laughed with him. "She's always been like that," she said, sipping her wine. Thin-skinned. And they moved on, like they hadn't just sliced something raw and left it bleeding. I used to think if I could just toughen up, I'd be easier to love. But years later, I realized I wasn't too sensitive. They were too cruel. It didn't come out as a scream, not at first. It came as a whisper, a shaky, trembling sentence that tasted like blood in my mouth. I deserve more. We were in the kitchen. Evening light stretched through the windows, golden and soft, but everything between us was sharp. My mother stood by the sink, rinsing out a glass like it mattered more than what I'd just said. She didn't look at me. That was her power move. Pretend I wasn't there. Pretend I didn't exist. But this time, I didn't shrink. "You heard me," I said, louder now. "I deserve more than this." She turned, finally, and there it was. That flicker. That flash of something in her eyes that wasn't disdain or annoyance. It was fear. Not fear of me. Fear of what I'd just become. A daughter who didn't accept silence as love anymore. A daughter who was finished begging for scraps. "Elena," she said sharply, drying her hands. "Don't start." "I'm not starting," I said. "I'm finishing." Her lips parted, but no words came. That terrified me more than anything, the silence that followed. It was the first time I'd broken the script, and she didn't know her line. "I'm not a mistake," I said. The air buzzed with it. Those words, that truth. "You've treated me like I'm something you regretted, like I'm your punishment. But I'm not. I'm not your shame. I'm not your secret. I'm not your goddamn mistake." My voice cracked, but I didn't let it break me. Not this time. I stood straighter. I let the fire burn through my chest and into my throat. She shook her head, but it was weak, like her muscles had forgotten how to argue with me. "Stop being so emotional," she muttered, the old armor slipping back into place. "No," I said, my voice cutting through her like a blade. "No more pretending. No more polite smiles. No more swallowing everything you refuse to admit." She looked older in that moment. Smaller, like a woman who'd built a fortress and just found the first crack in the wall. I took one breath, then another. My heart was pounding. My legs felt like they could give out any second, but I stayed standing, because I had to, because if I sat down, I might never get back up. "I'm not perfect," I said softly, "but I am not disposable. I am not broken, and I am not a fucking mistake." She opened her mouth again, but this time I turned first. I walked out of the kitchen, out of the house, into the night air that felt cooler than it should have. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for her to follow. It started with the filing cabinet in the upstairs hallway, second drawer from the bottom, always locked, always off limits. I don't know what made me go for it that night. Maybe it was the echo of her voice in my head again, calling me a mistake with the same tone she used to discuss spoiled milk. Maybe it was the way the house creaked under my feet like it knew something I didn't. Or maybe I was just tired of accepting half-truths and blank stares. The key was in her jewelry box, tucked beneath a strand of pearls she never wore. She'd never imagine I'd look there, because to her, I was still the obedient daughter, the girl who smiled through bruises you couldn't see. The drawer didn't resist. It slid open smooth and silent like it had been waiting. Old bank statements, medical files, legal documents thick with fine print. I didn't even know what I was looking for, just that I'd know it when I saw it. And then I did. Tucked between tax returns and life insurance policies was a manila envelope. No label, no date, just sealed, like it wanted to stay asleep. I opened it anyway. Inside was a copy of my birth certificate, only it wasn't the one I'd seen before. This one had a different last name, typed in faint letters next to father. Daniel Klein. Not Michael Rivera, the man I'd called Dad until he walked out when I was 10. There was more. A hospital form with a scribbled note at the bottom. Declined paternity acknowledgement. A letter from a law office, unsigned, advising termination remains legal until week 20. My hands shook. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just rejection. This was erasure. A choice. A decision to hide, to rename, to rewrite. She hadn't just resented me. She'd tried to undo me. I stared at the page like it might change if I blinked long enough. But it didn't. It sat there quietly, daring me to understand what I now knew. I was never meant to exist in the world she'd built. I was the thing she tried to remove, then hide, then resent when I refused to disappear. I dug deeper, found old journals with torn pages. One entry, half scratched out, read, "If I have to keep her, I'll do it alone. No one can know. No one can know." But I knew now. And that knowing felt like acid under my skin. Every birthday, every silent dinner, every side glance when I spoke too loud, it all made sense. The rejection wasn't emotional, it was structural, intentional, planned. She didn't just not love me. She never wanted me at all. It started with a forgotten folder on the dining room table, pale blue, thick with papers, left behind after one of David's strategy sessions with our mother. She'd gone upstairs to take a call. He'd stepped out to smoke. I was just passing through. At first, I only glanced at it. I wasn't trying to snoop. But then I saw the letterhead, the family company's name across the top. A spreadsheet poked out from under a typed memo, and something about the numbers made me pause. They didn't add up. $12,000 in consulting expenses, paid to a name I didn't recognize, repeated monthly. Then another vendor. The same charges, just under a different company name. A pattern. My stomach twisted. I slid the folder open and flipped through quickly, my heart pounding harder with every page. It wasn't just messy bookkeeping. It was deliberate. Clean, quiet theft, masked as operations spending. And David's signature stamped on every line. He wasn't just taking, he was laundering the golden boy, the one who never got grounded, the one she called brilliant, who just needed time to find his path. Turns out, he found it, right through the center of our family's money. I stood there, numb, trying to piece together the timeline. It had been going on for almost 2 years. Tens of thousands, maybe more, funneled out through fake vendors. And somehow no one had noticed. Or maybe they had. Maybe she had. That night, I tested her. I mentioned in passing how I'd seen some irregular reports in the company files. Her face didn't even flinch. She just raised a brow and said, "Accounting always looks messy if you don't know what you're reading." And that was my answer. She knew. Of course she knew. She wasn't just protecting him. She was helping him, covering for him like she always had, like when he crashed Dad's car and blamed it on a hit and run, and she paid the repair shop in cash, like when he cheated on his SATs, and she convinced the school counselor to lose the report. And me? I once brought home a B+ in geometry and got a 2-week silent treatment. The rules had never been fair, but this wasn't just favoritism. This was crime. And still, she coddled him like he was made of glass, and I was made of nothing. She'd burn down the whole house to keep David's reputation spotless. But now, I held the match, and I was no longer afraid of fire. The envelope was tucked behind old tax returns, faded and brittle like something the house itself had been trying to forget. Cream-colored, unsealed, addressed in my mother's tight, elegant handwriting. The name wasn't mine, not yet. Just a last name, Hawthorne Family Law, and a date from 29 years ago, circled in red ink. Inside, a letter, formal, cold, legal language wrapped in clinical distance. This correspondence confirms receipt of your inquiry regarding private adoption options. I sat on the floor, back pressed against the linen closet door, the paper trembling in my hands. My name didn't appear until halfway through the letter, where it said the child in parentheses, and then in my mother's handwriting in the margin, female, due, August. I read it again and again. She tried to give me away. Before I had a name, before I had fingers, before I even took a breath in this world, she was already trying to erase me from hers. There was more. A stapled set of draft paperwork, the beginnings of a file. No signatures, no final dates. Just intent, just enough to feel like a punch to the chest. I flipped the last page over and found something that didn't belong. A handwritten note, scribbled in a frantic scrawl I almost didn't recognize as hers. He won't go through with it. He says we'll make it work. But I know I can't. I'm not ready. I don't want this. I can't love her. I can't love her. The words stared up at me, louder than any shout, crueler than any slap. It wasn't just a moment of weakness. It wasn't postpartum. It wasn't stress or panic or pressure. It was choice. She didn't want me. Not then. Not ever. I folded the letter back into the envelope, with hands that didn't feel like mine. The room around me swayed. I reached for the wall, but it didn't help. Nothing did. Because everything I thought was history, everything I thought I'd earned, was just an aftershock of this one truth. I was not her daughter by love. I was her failure to escape. And suddenly, it made sense. The coldness, the absence, the indifference that clung to every memory like dust. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't some mystery I'd never solved. It was design. She built a life she didn't want me in, and when that didn't work, she taught me how to disappear in other ways. But I was still here, breathing, reading, feeling, and now I had proof. She tried to erase me, but I would be the one to write the ending. Mila didn't say anything for a long time. She just sat there, legs crossed on my bed, a hand wrapped around her mug like she was trying to warm her fingers and her heart at the same time. I had just finished telling her everything: the adoption letter, the forged documents, the fake father on my birth certificate. The silence afterward stretched long enough to make me think maybe I'd gone too far, that even she would look at me differently now. Then she blinked, and I saw it, the tears sitting heavy in her eyes, her lip trembling like she couldn't decide if she was going to cry or explode. "She was supposed to love you," Mila whispered. "That's the one job, Elle. Just love your child." I stared at the floor, afraid that if I looked up, I'd break. She said I was a mistake. I heard her, with my own ears. She said she didn't want me, and now I know it's true. She tried to get rid of me before I was even born. Mila didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. She leaned in, both hands clutching mine now, her voice low and shaking. "You weren't the mistake, Elena. She was. She was the mistake, for thinking she could treat someone like you as if you were disposable." Her words cracked something in me, not like a wound reopening, more like a frozen place thawing after too long in the dark. Because no one had ever said that to me before, not once. No one had ever taken my side without adding a but. Not my teachers, not my father, not even myself. I pressed my hand over my mouth, but it didn't stop the sob. It came out messy, loud, the kind that starts in the chest and rises like it's been waiting years for release. Mila pulled me into her arms, and I didn't resist. I let myself be held like I was someone worth holding. I shook and cried into her shoulder while she rubbed my back and whispered, "You're here. You survived her. And that means she didn't win." Later, when the tears slowed and the shaking stopped, I asked, "Do you think I'm broken?" She looked at me like I'd spoken another language. "No," she said. "I think you're proof that even when people fail us completely, we can still become something beautiful." And just like that, something inside me started to stitch back together. Not perfectly, not all at once. But for the first time, I wasn't alone in the wreckage. Someone saw me, and they didn't look away. The mirror had always been a quiet enemy. Not because I hated how I looked, but because it reflected someone I barely recognized. A girl too practiced in shrinking, too skilled in hiding. I used to stare at my reflection and try to find what was wrong with me, the flaw my mother had spent years treating like fact. I'd tilt my face this way, that way, whisper questions I was too afraid to ask out loud. Why didn't she love me? What did I do wrong? But tonight was different. The bathroom light hummed overhead. The house was quiet. Mila had just left, her words still echoing in the space she'd filled with warmth. I stood alone, the envelope of proof tucked in my drawer, the pain still fresh but no longer consuming. I looked in the mirror like I was meeting someone new, or maybe someone I'd known once, before shame moved in. I didn't see the girl who needed to be chosen. I didn't see the daughter who was discarded before she had a chance to cry. I saw me. Just me. There was something fierce in my eyes, something tired, yes, but solid. Real. There were dark circles under them from nights spent unraveling lies, but they didn't make me look weak. They made me look like I'd survived something most people wouldn't understand. I raised a hand to my own reflection, palm hovering just above the cool glass. "You're still here," I whispered. That meant something. She hadn't wanted me, but I existed anyway. She'd tried to erase me, and still I had left my mark. Not just on paper or in files or in secrets I'd uncovered, but in people like Mila, who loved me for who I was. In the life I'd built, brick by trembling brick, in the courage it took to face the truth and not flinch. I was never the problem. I had tried to mold myself into someone lovable, someone acceptable, for her. But no matter how I twisted myself, it was never enough. Because I was never what she wanted, and that wasn't a reflection of me. It was a reflection of her. For the first time, I smiled into the mirror. Not because I had to. Not the careful, calculated kind of smile I used at family dinners. This one reached my eyes. It didn't beg. It didn't apologize. It said, I know who I am. I wasn't broken. I wasn't invisible. And I was never, ever a mistake. It wasn't hate that moved my hands. It wasn't rage or vengeance or some desperate need to make her feel what I had felt all those years. It was something colder, cleaner, a kind of clarity I hadn't known I was capable of until now. This wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. I sat at the kitchen table in my apartment, the surface covered in documents, screenshots, and recordings. The soft click of my keyboard was the only sound in the room, each stroke like a heartbeat. I had spent so long letting them write the story of who I was. Now, finally, I was writing my own. The USB drive sat near my coffee mug, waiting. Inside it, proof of David's fake vendor payments, voice recordings of his drunken confessions, emails with my mother's approval of transactions that should have triggered internal audits. Her signature was on too many things for her to ever plead ignorance. They had protected each other like royalty, untouchable, unquestioned. But even the most polished dynasty cracks when the truth is loud enough. I wasn't planning a dramatic explosion. No shouting matches or flung wine glasses or viral videos. I wasn't her. I didn't need theatrics to be heard. I needed timing. I needed precision. The anniversary dinner would be perfect. Dozens of family members, business associates, old friends who still sent Christmas cards. The perfect audience for a legacy built on appearances. I'd arrive late. Slip in quiet, calm. Let them talk first. Let them smile and toast themselves and pass around fake memories like expensive appetizers. Then, when the moment was right, when she was basking in the light of their admiration, I'd hand her the truth. Not with a scream, not with tears, just with silence. Calm, undeniable silence. Because there's something far more terrifying than a woman screaming, a woman who doesn't have to anymore. I made copies of everything, sent a sealed folder to Mila with instructions. If anything happens to me, you know what to do. She didn't ask questions, just nodded. I wasn't scared. I should have been. But the fear that had lived in me for so long was gone, replaced by something steadier, stronger. They had built a house of lies, brick by careful brick, believing no one would ever look too closely, believing I was too small, too soft, too eager to please. But they forgot something. The one they tried to erase? She was watching, and now she was done waiting. The dining room looked like something out of a magazine. Polished wood, silver chargers, napkins folded like lilies. Everything perfect, everything curated. Like if you made the setting beautiful enough, no one would notice the rot underneath. They were all there. David, in a tailored suit, already 3 drinks in and holding court like the star of a show no one else auditioned for. My mother, in her signature cream blouse, the pearls she only wore when she wanted to be admired. Her smile had been steady all evening, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Not tonight. I walked in just as the soup course was being served. Late, but not enough to be rude. Just enough to be noticed. Conversations dipped as I took my seat. She clocked it. The silence that followed me. The glances. My calm. "Elena," she said, her voice feather light. "So glad you could make it." I smiled. Wouldn't miss it. The table was long, too long. like it had been designed to keep people at a distance even when they were breaking bread. Crystal glasses caught the light. A centerpiece of white roses sprawled across the middle like a barrier between sides. They talked about the market, about David's promotion, about the charity gala they'd be attending next month. Not one word about me, not one question about my life, as if I were just another ornament on the table. Until I raised my glass. "To honesty," I said. It cut through the room like a blade. My mother's smile twitched. Her fingers curled tighter around her fork. David's jaw clenched. "To the stories we tell," I continued, my voice steady, "and the truths we bury." No one said anything. The clink of silverware was suddenly deafening. I met her eyes, held them. I watched the exact moment she realized I wasn't bluffing, that I knew everything. Her hands went still. That was always her tell, when she stopped moving, stopped pretending. "Elena," she said quietly, not a warning, not yet, but a plea disguised as concern. But I wasn't the quiet daughter tonight. I turned to the others. I used to think silence kept us safe, that not saying certain things meant preserving peace, but silence just protects the wrong people. David shifted beside her. "What are you doing?" he hissed under his breath. I looked down at the folder beside my plate, the one that hadn't been there a moment ago, my hand resting on it like a promise. "Just starting the meal," I said, and smiled. For the first time in years, I watched her squirm. And God, it tasted better than anything on that table. The wine had made him generous. That was always David's weakness. He never knew when to stop, especially when an audience was close and the bottle wasn't empty. His voice, usually smug and sharp-edged, had taken on a lazy swagger, like he believed his words were gold no matter how they slurred at the edges. He leaned toward me across the table, his tie loosened, the flush in his cheeks creeping past polite. "You know, I always figured you'd be the one to crack," he said, grinning like he was letting me in on some big family secret. "All that pressure, all that being ignored. I mean, you were never really one of us, right?" I blinked slowly, steadying my breath. My phone was angled just right on the table, screen dark, voice memo app recording every syllable. He laughed into his glass. "Don't look at me like that. You knew it too. Mom never saw you. Not really. But me? I could do anything, and she'd still call me brilliant." I nodded, just once. Let him keep going. "She's been covering my ass since college," he said, swirling his wine. "Remember the failed investment deal in 2019? Yeah, not a failure. I rerouted the money, paid off some old debt. She signed off on it, said it would keep the family image clean." He chuckled, took another sip. His eyes were glossy, almost childlike. "And those consulting payments I put through last year? Fake. All of them. But no one checked. No one ever checks the golden boy." I stared at him, letting silence draw him deeper into the hole he was digging. Sometimes you don't have to push. You just have to wait. "She said you wouldn't understand," he added with a smirk. "Said you were too emotional, too fragile, that you'd break if you knew how things really worked in this family." He winked. "I guess we both underestimated you." That was the moment he'd remember. The way my face didn't change, how I lifted my wine glass with that same practiced calm I'd used at every family dinner. The moment he started to realize something was wrong, but couldn't quite name what. I toasted him silently, then stood up. "I need some air," I said. He waved me off with a lazy salute, already turning to his next glass. I stepped out onto the porch, heart hammering. The cold air bit at my skin, but I barely felt it. My fingers shook as I stopped the recording, saved it, uploaded it to the cloud. His confession, her complicity, every word now existed outside of memory. No longer whispers, no longer deniable. Now, it was evidence. It was smaller than I expected. Just a simple black USB drive tucked inside a velvet pouch Mila had once given me for earrings. It looked like nothing. Ordinary, forgettable. The kind of thing you'd lose in the bottom of a drawer and never think twice about, but I couldn't stop staring at it, because inside it was everything. The audio recording from dinner, where David poured out his confessions between sips of wine like they were bedtime stories. The spreadsheets I'd copied from my mother's home office, names of non-existent vendors, payments that didn't belong, dates that told the story better than words ever could. The emails she thought she'd deleted recovered with a data tool Mila helped me install. Subject lines like, "Just make it look clean," and "He needs another favor." All of it lived on that tiny black sliver of plastic. The betrayal wasn't what gutted me. I'd grown up on betrayal, on being passed over, talked over, erased. That part wasn't new. What hit hardest was the effort they had put into maintaining the lie, the way they protected each other over and over while feeding me scraps of civility, the realization that I was never even meant to be part of the plan. I was the ghost they kept in the hallway, useful only when someone needed contrast. Golden boy, forgotten girl. He took the money. She signed the forms. They clinked glasses while I earned degrees and folded laundry and showed up to every family dinner with a smile so practiced it felt carved into my face. I held the USB in my hand, pressing it between my fingers, wondering if they'd still call me too sensitive once this hit a courtroom, wondering if my mother would still sit with perfect posture while watching her world unravel, wondering if David would still smirk once someone smarter than him started asking questions under oath. There was power in this. Not revenge, not even justice, really. Something deeper, like peeling off a mask I'd been forced to wear for decades and finally breathing real air. I slipped the drive into a second envelope, sealed it, and addressed it to the family company's board of directors. Mila would drop it off Monday, just in case I changed my mind. But I wouldn't. I already had a backup saved in the cloud, and a copy in my coat pocket. This wasn't a warning shot. It was the truth. Neatly packaged, irrefutable. Delivered not with fury, but with quiet, undeniable resolve. They taught me how to survive in silence. But this was me learning how to speak. The office smelled like old paper and polish, the kind of place where secrets go to sleep until someone dares to wake them. Everything inside was too neat, too still, like even the dust had been arranged deliberately. I sat across from him. Harold Benton, my father's former lawyer, though now I wasn't sure which man father even referred to. He adjusted his glasses, took one look at the letter I had handed him, the one I'd found folded behind a stack of legal drafts in my mother's drawer, and let out a long, quiet sigh. "I was wondering when you'd come," he said. That sentence alone made my chest tighten. He knew. He had always known. "I'm not here to make trouble," I said, though my voice wavered. I need the truth. All of it." He looked at me, not unkindly. "Trouble was made long before you walked in this door." He slid open a drawer, pulled out a thin, worn file. No label, no markings. But the moment he set it down between us, my hands went cold. He didn't push it toward me, just let it sit there like it might burn if touched too quickly. "Your mother came to me once," he said. "Years ago, before she married Michael Rivera. She wanted to make sure her past would stay buried. There was a man she knew in college, Daniel Klein. She said it ended badly, that she was pregnant. She asked what her options were." My mouth went dry. I already knew the answer, but hearing the name from someone else made it real. My chest felt tight, like my ribs were closing in. "Michael," I asked quietly. "He knew?" Harold hesitated. "He suspected, but he agreed to raise you as his own under one condition. No contact with the biological father, no acknowledgement, nothing to disturb the image of a perfect family." I felt the heat rise in my face, not from shame, but fury, Controlled, contained, the kind that burns slow and steady. Image, always the image, as if my life had been a prop in a show I never auditioned for. I opened the file with shaking fingers. Inside was a single photo. Daniel Klein, age 21, a copy of an old student ID. Sharp jawline, dark eyes, thick brows. My eyes. I stared at it, at him, and for a moment I forgot to breathe. Not because he looked familiar, but because I didn't look like a stranger for once. There were more documents, an old address, a place in Oregon, the last known location before he dropped off the radar. No contact, no follow-up. He never knew about me. And still, in a room full of lies, that fact felt like the only piece of truth. Maybe I wasn't part of the family I thought I had, but maybe, just maybe, I still had one waiting. The send button didn't make a sound. No dramatic ding, no flash of light, just a soft click, almost gentle. You'd think something so small couldn't cause an earthquake. But I knew better. My laptop sat open on the kitchen counter, the emails still visible, each one sent to a different name. A journalist, a detective, the internal board at Rivera Holdings. All of them now had the same thing, the contents of the USB. My family's empire in digital form, stripped bare, every transaction, every falsified record, David's confession, my mother's signature clear as day, the truth. I didn't feel powerful. Not yet. I felt steady, like the ground beneath me had finally stopped shifting, like I wasn't the one holding the lie anymore, and maybe that meant I could finally breathe. The silence afterward was deafening. I stood there staring at the screen, waiting for something to happen, for the house to groan, for the lights to flicker, for a voice, hers, his, anyone's, to burst through the air demanding I undo it all. Nothing came. I walked to the window. Outside, the street looked exactly the same. A couple walked their dog. A car rolled by. The world didn't care that I'd just lit a match and held it to 30 years of family myth. That everything they'd worked to protect, the image, the perfection, the name, was now unraveling. But I cared, because I'd spent a lifetime inside that illusion, performing, smiling, nodding, making myself smaller so their version of the truth would have more room to stretch out and sprawl. Now the illusion was on fire, and I didn't plan to put it out. My phone buzzed once, then again, then 7 more times. I didn't check it. I didn't need to. I could already picture the chaos. David screaming, my mother pacing, trying to control the narrative like she always did. But this time, the narrative didn't belong to them. Not anymore. There was no monologue, no last-minute defense, no pretty speech that could unsend what had been sent. It was done. The damage was already rippling, quietly, steadily. And this time, I wasn't the one breaking. They were. And not because I wanted revenge. That wasn't it. I didn't need them to suffer. I just needed them to stop pretending. I closed the laptop gently, picked up my coat, and walked out the door. The cold air hit my face like a second wind. Behind me, the house stood still, unaware. Ahead of me, the world finally looked like mine. Not built on someone else's rules, not shaped by their silence. Mine. And if the fire kept burning, let it. The room was already humming before I walked in, crystal glasses clinking, fake laughter echoing against high ceilings, the kind of polished chaos my family excelled at. My mother wore her usual mask of grace, laughing at someone's joke without actually hearing it. David stood near the fireplace, holding a glass of scotch like it was a crown. They looked untouchable, as if the walls would never cave in, until they did. I stepped into the center of the room, slow and silent, like a ghost interrupting a feast. Eyes turned, but no one spoke. My presence wasn't expected, which meant it wasn't welcomed. Not really. Still, no one dared to stop me. "I have something to share," I said, loud enough for the conversation to die mid-sentence. My mother's smile stiffened. David squinted, confused. My father, if I could still call him that, cleared his throat, already impatient. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket, opened the recording, pressed play. It started quietly. Just David's voice, lazy and thick with wine. She's been covering my ass since college. At first, no one understood what they were hearing. Then came the silence, the sharp kind, like air being sucked out of the room. The consulting payments I put through last year? Fake. All of them. Heads turned toward David. His glass paused halfway to his mouth. She said you wouldn't understand. Said you were too emotional, too fragile. That you'd break if you knew how things really worked. The recording crackled, paused, then David again, with that drunk smirk laced into his words. I guess we both underestimated you. Someone gasped. It might have been my aunt, or the woman from the board of directors. I couldn't tell. My heartbeat was louder. I looked at David. He had gone pale. You recorded me? He asked, voice low and trembling beneath the surface. I nodded. Yes. My mother stepped forward. Elena, stop this now. I started it, I said. Now everyone gets to hear how it ends. The room was still frozen when I slipped the USB from my pocket and set it on the side table beside the untouched champagne. I turned to the crowd, relatives, business partners, lifelong friends who had smiled at every lie they'd been fed. If I'm going to be called a mistake, I said, then let me at least be the one who ends theirs. I didn't wait for applause, or anger, or tears. I walked out as quietly as I'd entered, and behind me, the truth kept playing. She didn't speak. That was the first thing I noticed, how still she had gone. My mother, the queen of explanations and polished lies, stood frozen in the center of the room, one manicured hand still hovering midair like she'd forgotten what it was meant to be doing. Her face, so expertly composed, so well rehearsed, cracked at the edges. And then it just fell apart. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. No sound came out, not the usual sharp retort, not the subtle correction. Nothing. She looked at me the way people look at oncoming traffic. Not furious, not broken, just stunned. Like she'd stepped out of the story she had written and finally realized she wasn't the author anymore. For once, there was no script, no excuse to hand out like candy, no, she's just sensitive, no, it's a family misunderstanding, no way to spin her way out of the voice they'd all just heard, David's voice, confessing everything. Her signature on the documents, her complicity, her silence. And everyone saw it now. The board members who used to shake her hand, the family friends who used to envy our picture-perfect life, even the cousins who never looked me in the eye unless prompted. They all saw the truth now, not in the recording, in her. Her silence was louder than the scandal. Her face kept moving, eyebrows twitching, lips parting and pressing together, eyes darting across the room like they were searching for a trap door. Something, anything. But there was no one to blame this time, no scapegoat to toss into the fire, no way to make me the villain in a story where I had simply held up a mirror. Her hand went to her throat lightly, like she was choking on her own name. I waited, gave her the chance, one last window to tell the truth, to finally say something real. She didn't. She turned her back, walked away. Slow, fragile steps toward the hallway like it might all disappear if she could just get out of the room fast enough. But the silence she left behind wasn't empty. It was damning. The woman who always had the last word had nothing left. And I didn't chase her. I didn't need her to cry. I didn't need her to beg. That wasn't what this had ever been about. This wasn't revenge. It was revelation. And her face, cracked, exposed, finally human, was more honest than anything she'd ever said to me. For the first time in my life, she was the one who couldn't look me in the eye. And I'd never stood taller. I didn't cry, not when the USB played its final seconds, Not when the silence settled like a blanket of ash over the wreckage. Not even when my mother turned her face away from mine, her jaw clenched like she might crack if she spoke. I had cried too many times before, in rooms just like this one, where no one listened. Tonight, I wasn't offering them that anymore. I stood slowly, calmly, not like someone storming out, like someone finished. All eyes followed me. Not in pity, not in confusion, in awe, maybe. Or disbelief, or something colder. But I didn't look away. I let them watch me. Let them finally see me. My father, Michael, the man who had raised me but never quite held me, rose halfway from his seat. "Elena," he said, his voice a half command, half question. I held up my hand, not to silence him, but to stop the performance. "Don't," I said, and it came out steady. Stronger than I felt, but real enough to keep him frozen in place. My mother hadn't moved from the doorway. She stood like a statue, lips tight, spine straight, like the weight of her silence was the only thing keeping her upright. She looked like she wanted to speak, to claw the air and take everything back, twist it into something safer. But she didn't. She couldn't. So I gave her what she never gave me, truth. "I may have been your mistake," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like glass. "But letting me go? That was yours." I let the words hang. No apology, no smile, just a full, raw moment of clarity. My clarity. Then I turned and walked out. I didn't look back. Not at David, who still hadn't said a word since the recording played. Not at the relatives shifting in their chairs, pretending not to notice the tremble in their wine glasses. Not at the paintings on the wall that had watched me shrink my whole life. The hallway felt longer than it ever had. Each step away from that room was like shedding a layer of skin I no longer needed. The girl who begged for approval, who tried to earn a seat at that table, was gone. And she wasn't coming back. At the door, I paused only once. Just long enough to feel the air shift. Somewhere behind me, I thought I heard my mother inhale, like she might finally speak. She didn't. So I opened the door, stepped into the cool night, and let it close behind me. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was running away. I felt like I was walking towards something better. The headlines came first. Quiet, then louder. Board member under investigation for fraudulent vendor scheme. Then, family empire under scrutiny. After leaked audio reveals embezzlement, cover-up. No names at first, then one. David Rivera. He tried to deny it, of course he did, called it a smear campaign, a personal vendetta. But the tape didn't lie, neither did the documents, and the board didn't hesitate. By the end of the week, he was stripped of his title. His office was cleaned out overnight, his accounts frozen. I watched it all from a distance. I didn't gloat. I didn't cheer. I just breathed. For once, I could exhale without the taste of ash. My mother disappeared. Not literally, she still lived in the same house, still wore the same tailored suits, but she stopped going out. Declined every gala invitation, canceled her appointments. She pulled the blinds down like truth couldn't crawl under the door. The reporters still came. Sat in cars parked on the street like vultures in expensive jackets. Occasionally, someone brave enough would ring the bell. No one answered. Her silence, once a weapon, had become a shield. But shields crack under pressure. I heard from one of her old friends that she'd started seeing a therapist, that she didn't speak during her first 3 sessions, just sat there, eyes glassy, hands folded like she was in church. I don't know if that's true. I didn't ask. I didn't need to know. My father, Michael, filed for divorce 3 weeks after the story broke. Irreconcilable differences, the papers said, but really, it was image. He didn't want the stink of it on him. A sinking ship wasn't a good look for a man who'd built a life out of appearances. He called me once, just once, left a voicemail I never responded to. "Elena," he said, voice hollow. "I didn't know the extent. I just want you to know I'm sorry, For whatever part I played. For whatever part. As if he couldn't even name it. I deleted it. The thing no one tells you about walking through fire is that the burn doesn't always show on your skin. Sometimes it's deeper, quieter. But sometimes, if you've spent your whole life learning how to take the heat, you walk out the other side untouched. I didn't rise from the ashes. I was never in them. They burned themselves down. I just handed them the match. It arrived in a plain white envelope. No return address, no logo, just my name in unfamiliar handwriting. I had almost missed it in the pile of junk mail, but something about it stopped me. Maybe it was the neatness of the script. Maybe it was the way it felt heavier than paper should. Inside was a letter, a single page folded once. The first line made my breath catch. My name is Daniel Klein. I believe I'm your father. I sat down, legs giving out beneath me, the paper trembling in my hands. I read the letter 3 times before I could even process the words. He said he'd never known, that no one told him, that if he had, he would have come, that he'd have done everything, anything, to be there. There was a DNA test confirmation attached. I had sent in my sample weeks earlier, hoping, doubting, preparing myself for nothing. But it matched. He wasn't a ghost or a name buried in an old drawer. He was real, alive, waiting. He lived in a small town in Oregon, owned a bookstore, never married, no other kids. He wrote that when he received the message from Harold, the lawyer, he didn't believe it at first. But when he saw the photo Harold included, me, age 11, standing stiff in a school uniform, he said his heart just stopped. I didn't wait. I called him that night. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. The line rang once, twice. Then he picked up. Hello? His voice was soft, careful, like he didn't dare hope. Daniel? I said, even though I already knew. He paused, just a second, and then he started to cry. Not a sob, not a wail. Just quiet, broken tears, like he'd been holding them for years without knowing why. I'm sorry, he whispered. I didn't know. And I believed him. I didn't speak much. I didn't need to. He filled the silence with everything I never got to hear as a child. I would have held you. I would have stayed. I would have read you bedtime stories and walked you to school. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He asked for time. I want to know you, he said, if you'll let me. The ache inside me didn't vanish, but it shifted, softened. Because for the first time I wasn't chasing love. I was being offered it, not as an obligation, not as a performance, but as a father meeting his daughter, for the first time, with nothing but truth in his voice. The door opened slowly, like he was afraid I might disappear if he moved too fast. Daniel stood there, older than the photo in the letter, but his eyes, those deep, familiar eyes, held something I'd never seen in anyone who shared my blood. Recognition. He didn't speak right away. Neither did I. For a long moment, we just stared at each other like the silence might explain the years we missed. He looked at me the way you look at something you lost a long time ago and never thought you'd find again. I hadn't expected that. I hadn't expected anything, really. I had told myself to keep it simple, civil, cautious. But then he took one step forward, and I didn't move. He asked, softly, "May I?" I nodded, and he pulled me into his arms. It wasn't tentative. It wasn't light or polite or careful. It was full. It was real. He wrapped both arms around me and held me like I was something sacred, like I wasn't a question mark or a regret, like he'd been waiting his whole life to prove he could hold me and not let go. And I let him. I let myself be small in that moment, not weak, just real. I felt the weight of everything melt off my shoulders, the quiet birthdays, the polite handshakes from the man I used to call Dad, the way my mother flinched at touch. All of it burned away in that one embrace. He smelled like cedar and coffee. His hands were warm, I could feel the quiet tremble in his chest, the uneven rhythm of someone trying not to break. And I realized I wasn't the only one grieving the years we never had. He whispered, "I'm so sorry," against my hair. "You deserved so much more." I didn't cry at first. I thought I couldn't. But standing there, pressed against someone who wanted nothing from me but me, I felt the walls crack. My chin tucked into his shoulder, and the tears came, hot, quiet, years in the making. But they weren't the same tears I used to cry into a pillow. They weren't silent screams or desperate prayers. These tears were release, a letting go. When we finally pulled apart, he looked at me like I was something whole. "You're not a mistake," he said. "You never were." I believed him. Because for the first time in my life, I was being held by someone who didn't need to be convinced I was worth loving. He already knew. The keys felt cold in her hand, but in the best way, like something real, something hers. Elena stood at the threshold of her new apartment, fingers resting on the doorknob, heart steady in her chest. She turned it slowly, almost ceremonially, and stepped inside. No one followed her. No voice trailed behind telling her to wipe her feet, to be quieter, to smile smaller. The silence greeted her like an old friend. She closed the door, and for the first time, she didn't lock it out of fear. She locked it because this space belonged to her. The living room was still mostly empty. A couch sat in the corner, its cushions slightly askew from the movers. Sunlight poured through the wide windows, dancing across bare walls and wood floors. She took off her shoes and let her feet touch the cool surface. It grounded her. No rugs yet, no art, just freedom. She walked from room to room, bedroom, kitchen, the tiny nook she planned to turn into a reading corner, and exhaled. Not just air, everything. Years of tension, of watching her volume, her tone, her face. She didn't have to be careful here. She could just be. By evening, music played low from the speakers she'd unpacked first. Nina Simone hummed from the corner, soft and defiant. There were no dinner rules. She ate standing up, barefoot, with a bowl of pasta and a glass of wine, swaying to the rhythm of her own new beginning. The plants came next. A row of snake plants lined the window, a fig tree by the balcony, a scattering of succulents on the kitchen counter, things that grew quietly, things that didn't demand much but still reached for the light. She placed a framed photo of her and Mila on the windowsill. Another of Daniel, her real father, laughing with a book open in his hands. She didn't crowd the shelves, just enough to remind herself that love existed, and she had found it. The walls were quiet, but not empty. They didn't echo with slammed doors or sharp whispers. They didn't hum with the weight of unspoken pain. They simply held her, gently, steadily. Later, as the sun dipped and the sky turned lavender, she lit a candle and sat on the floor, back against the couch. No phone, no TV, just the warmth of her own presence. For the first time in her life, Elena breathed without flinching. Not for anyone else, not to survive, just to be alive. She sat at her desk just after midnight, the soft glow of a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, the city exhaled, quiet, distant, alive. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure for only a moment. Then they began to move. The first line came easily. To every mistake they tried to erase, it wasn't just her story anymore. It was a letter to every girl who'd been told to be smaller. To every child born into coldness and silence. Into homes where love was rationed like punishment and acceptance came with a list of conditions. To every daughter who sat in rooms filled with noise but still felt invisible. She wrote about the lies, the polished smiles, the secrets whispered behind locked doors, about the way shame was passed down like an heirloom, about her mother's cold hands and her brother's cruelty dressed up as charm. About all the years she bent herself into something palatable, hoping it might earn her a seat at a table she never belonged to. And then she wrote about the shift. About truth, about fire, about the night she stood in front of them and refused to shrink again. The night she looked at the woman who birthed her and saw, finally, a stranger. She didn't write with bitterness. That was the old story. This one was stitched together with strength, with defiance, with love, for herself, and for every soul who had ever been made to feel like an accident. She wrote about Mila and her father in Oregon, and the hug that rewrote something in her bones, about the quiet joy of her new apartment, the way sunlight poured through her windows like it had been waiting for her, about music and plants and stillness that felt like safety. She wrote because someone, somewhere, was still waiting to hear that they weren't broken, that surviving wasn't shameful, that walking away wasn't weakness, that healing isn't always loud, but it is always holy. By the time the sun began to rise, her screen was filled with pages. Truth on every one. Not revenge, not exposure, reclamation. She saved the file. Then she whispered it aloud, just once, to the empty room that had finally learned her name. I was never a mistake. She smiled. I was a miracle they never deserved.